Well, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Joseph Teft, the first mayor of the city of Elgin, elected in 1854, the year in which the city became incorporated. I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. I was born in 1812 in Lebanon, New York, a town in central upstate New York. And as a young boy, when I visited my uncle's house, I used to like to go in his study and read his medical books. And this led to my graduating from the College of Medicine in Woodstock, Vermont in 1833. The following year, I married a childhood sweetheart, Ermeline Gilbert, and in 1835, Ermeline and I, my father and his family, and two other families decided to leave New York and come west to Illinois. So we secured some ox-driven wagons, loaded up essential items, and we set out late summer. Our heavier items would come overland by water through the Great Lakes. Now, in early fall, we came to Illinois, to the Fox River area, and we left the women at a settlement on the Des Plaines River, and the menfolk went further west looking for a suitable site for living. We found places that interested us. I took a claim to a site in what today is South Elgin, and my father claimed land northeast of there, which today would be on the east side of Elgin. And I set about developing my medical practice. Now, I was kind of a unique physician because I made house calls. I was a traveling doctor. I had an old gray mare that I rode, and many a night I would sleep under the stars, weather permitting, or I would spend the night in the home of one of my patients that I was visiting. And this became my signature for a number of years. Now, in 1838, I exchanged claims with my father and took his holdings on the east side of Elgin and moved Ermeline and myself up there. That same year, she gave birth to my first daughter, Mary Eliza, who unfortunately would only live till 1842 before succumbing. Now, I didn't live on the farm site on the east side of town. I built a small frame house in what is today downtown Elgin, near the intersections of Chicago and Spring Street, what many refer to as the first frame house in the village of Elgin. And I devoted my energy to my medical practice. In 1844, I had a second daughter that was born, Julia, but that same year tragedy befell our family. My wife passed away. 2 years later, though, in 1846, I remarried a woman that I knew from New York, and in 1848, I had a son, Leslie, who was born, who I'm proud to say would follow in my footsteps as a physician. Now, the 1840s were an exciting time in Elgin. The two burning issues of the day were abolition, the anti-slavery movement, and the temperance movement, prohibition. And I had strong feelings on both, and I joined what was at that time the leading church in Elgin that expounded positions favorable to me on both subjects, the First Congregational Church. And I attended many a meeting on these subjects. Now, another subject that was dear to my heart was Elgin's growth as a community, and I was worried because its present form of government under a village form was rather restricted. And I belonged to a group of people who in 1854 successfully petitioned the state of Illinois to grant us a charter as a city, which meant now that we had greater powers, especially in the field of taxation, so that the city could handle things and could grow in an orderly fashion. One of the things that was dear to my heart was one of the first things the first city council did in 1854 was to pass a prohibition ordinance. And through my first 2 terms as mayor, not a drop of liquor flowed in the city of Elgin. Now, being a doctor, I was especially proud of this because I didn't place faith in these tales that, you know, a medicinal drink is good for the body. I knew otherwise. I had seen enough people's insides to see what alcohol could do, how it could ruin the membranes of the stomach. And so I was very pleased. But I did not stay mayor for life, unfortunately. And after I left office, the taverns started to spring up, and in 1858, the city reversed itself and allowed the sale of alcohol. Another issue that was dear to my heart was in education, And I helped found the Elgin Academy. In fact, I became its first president in 1855, a post that I subsequently held until my death in 1888. Now, when the Civil War broke out, I became the examining physician for the 141st Illinois Regiment, which was training in Elgin. And I also became involved in another matter that was dear to my heart. In 1862, as the Union Army advanced south along the Mississippi River in a campaign, they came into control of thousands of former slaves. And they didn't know what to do with these people. Well, numerous groups up north, abolitionist groups, offered to help these people to make the transition into society. And 2 carloads of them came to Elgin in 1862, and I was proud that I was able to assist in the resettlement of 7 of those people, cause it meant a lot to me. Now, another area that I was interested in, besides medicine, was in the occupation that many people in the Fox Valley had taken up, that of dairy farming. Now, there were lots of dairy farms up and down the Fox River Valley. Milk was sent to Chicago, where it would be processed. Problem was that the prices for the milk were controlled by the processors in Chicago. Now, one way that we could kind of circumvent that, control the supply of milk somewhat, was to take surplus milk and turn it into butter and cheese. But again, we found when we went to sell the butter and cheese, the forces in Chicago were at work controlling the price. In 1872, I got the idea that we needed to form our own Board of Trade, which we did, the Elgin Board of Trade, and we set out to set the price for cheese and butter in Illinois and actually in the country. Now, the Chicago people were aghast at this and threatened to crush us, but we had some very large buyers from St. Louis and New Orleans who came and offered to buy all we could produce. And that destroyed the attempt by Chicago to take away our Board of Trade. I was elected the president of that Board of Trade, a post that I served for 3 years, and I was very proud of that. I was also instrumental in introducing a new strain of cow into the valley, the Holstein. And this dramatically changed the amount of milk that could be produced. I had one particular cow, her name was Zwan, and she was capable of producing the unheard of sum in 1874 of 8 gallons of milk a day. Now, I continued to be very active in agricultural groups. I became president of the Illinois Dairy Association. I was president of the Elgin Creamery. I took time to get involved in a railroad company that was in the Fox River Valley. I was the president of the Elgin Scientific Society. So I was involved in a number of things. As I grew older, though, I kind of got out of the practicing medicine field and I became a consulting physician. And I continued to do that until my death in 1888. Now, I happened to succumb to something called Bright's disease, which is a kidney failure. And in August, on the 26th, 3 days short of my 76th birthday, I passed away. Now, a post note on Dr. Teft's importance to the community. It's obvious from all the groups that I mentioned that he was very active in the area. But what really comes home is it took a little over 8 years to probate his will. Now, the reason for that was that in opening up all of his possessions and his holdings, it was discovered that there were accounts due, some of which went back as early as 1844 that hadn't been settled. And the good doctor was more interested in dispensing health to his patients than he was in trying to make a dollar. And so these had to be closed out before the will could be finalized. And so it took that. Now I think I'm going to retire to my resting spot. I hope you will enjoy this beautiful afternoon and visit 6 people who were instrumental in the early days of city government in Elgin. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Good Sunday afternoon, visitors and friends. My name is Huber, Joseph G. Huber of Elgin, Illinois. I am known for many things, but perhaps best known as the bricklayer who became Elgin's chief of police. Here is my story. I was born on March the 10th in 1896 to parents Rosine Summit and Gottlieb Huber. My father Gottlieb was a minister at the local Apostolic Christian Church. I had 3 brothers and 3 sisters. We all lived in a very large house over on Porter Street, which my grandfather helped to build. At home, the entire family spoke 2 languages, English as well as German. I was a graduate of Elgin High School and soon thereafter entered the trades as a bricklayer. I served in World War I, where my knowledge of the German language served me well. While in the Army, I and many others were subjected to chemicals used on us by the Germans in their quest to win the war. At the end of my service, I returned to my hometown of Elgin and to my trade as bricklayer. Many of us who served in the war and lived in Elgin were affiliated or members of the American Legion. Some of us formed a political group called the Ex-Servicemen's Republican Progressive Organization. It is there that I met a gentleman by the name of Myron H. Lehman. Mr. Lehman had some lofty ambitions in becoming Elgin's next mayor. I assisted Mr. Lehman in his endeavors, and as his campaign manager, was credited with helping him win an upset victory over the incumbent mayor. Grateful enough was Mayor-elect Lehman that he offered to me the position of City Marshal, a title which would soon be changed to Chief of Police, and a position which I proudly held for some 22 years. Mayor Lehman's first day in office was May the 4th, 1931, and my first day followed some 6 weeks later on June the 16th. And on that very first day in office, I enacted a policy strictly prohibiting the loitering in or around our operations room. Yes, I was a strict disciplinarian, this perhaps in large part to my training and education at the FBI Police Academy. During my 22 years of service as police chief, we tried to update the department by changing personnel, procedures, and policies. Some of those changes include, but are not limited to, the following. We hired younger police officers. They brought life and vitality to the force. We also hired non-uniformed police officers who had all of the same rights and privileges as their uniformed counterparts, but were hired strictly to wage war against speeders and reckless drivers. Speaking of that, we strictly enforced parking regulations and dramatically increased the Fingerprint Bureau. I was a big advocate of training our officers on the safe use and care of firearms. We also streamlined our filing system, and it became like no filing system before its time. Lastly, we were the second in the state of Illinois to begin the use of two-way radios. This eliminated the old red light system that we had before. Of all of my accomplishments throughout the years, none gave me greater personal satisfaction than the creation of the Elgin Boys League in 1940. This gave young teenage gentlemen a supervised place to go where they could be mentored by some of Elgin's police and dignitaries of our time. In 1954, I retired from the police force, feeling the effects of some ill health. I thought that if I returned to the great outdoors, breathing in the fresh air and doing the manual labor that I had so loved, that my health would begin to improve. But this plan took a small detour as I became Elgin's city clerk from July of 1954 until May of 1955. I had many professional affiliations throughout my career. You've already heard about the American Legions. I was also a member of the VFW, the Elgin Lodge, the Riverside Club, the Watch City, the International Association of Police Chiefs, and the Illinois Association of Police Chiefs. Lest you believe that I was married to my profession, I assure you I was not. I was married to a beautiful woman by the name of Agnes. Agnes and I had a special and particularly close relationship. Oftentimes I would refer to Agnes or call her directly my little monkey face. However, never in English. Agnes and I never had children of our own, but Agnes brought with her from a previous marriage 2 daughters and 1 son. We all lived at 272 Grand Boulevard. I can see that our time is growing short, which is a shame because I'd so love to tell you more about what I did. In particular, I'd love to tell you the details of how I solved the murder of Elginite Herman Holtz. But I understand that you have other places to go this afternoon and other people to meet. So as I say thank you for stopping by, I'd like to leave you with a friendly warning. As you leave these hallowed grounds today, please drive carefully and obey the speed limits, or you too can join the 13-year-old rat down at the jailhouse. Thank you for stopping by.
Well, hello. Won't you come in? Come sit down. Good afternoon and welcome to the party. Today is my birthday. My name is Nancy Currier Kimball, and today I am 217 years old. I was born on September 26, 1787 in Concord, New Hampshire, and I had no idea growing up there that I would someday be laid to rest in Elgin, which when I was alive was a tiny town in Wild, Illinois. Thank you so much for coming today, and I do so love Elgin, and I love to share what I know about it. My husband and I were married in 1805 when I was 18 years old, and we lived comfortably and happily for the next 30 years in New Hampshire until he made a trip to the Fox River Valley. Joseph, that's my husband, he fell in love with the lush green fields and the wide open spaces of Illinois. He raced back to New Hampshire to try to convince me and our 9 grown-up children to relocate with him to this area. Later that year, he made another trip to Illinois. And on this trip, first, he had to stop at the White House. He was a staunch Democrat, and tell President Andrew Jackson and Vice President Van Buren all about the wonders of the Prairie State. After my husband stopped at the White House, he continued on to Illinois, but he wasn't sure where he wanted to settle for sure, until he met Hezekiah and James Gifford in Chicago. The Gifford brothers told Joseph all about their little settlement on the Fox River. They told him how it was a good source of water power, how there was an excellent spot for a dam, and how with its location in an approximate line between Galena and Chicago, eventually they figured the railroad would run through Elgin as well. As we can see, and often hear, that's true. Well, my husband got sold on Elgin, and Joseph came and bought a plot of land on the west side of the river. Right now, it's where Orchard and Vine Streets intersect. There he built a cabin with the help of our son Samuel. In the outside, he even put apple trees with graftings from our orchard at home in New Hampshire. I never got to live with my husband in that cabin. My Joseph took terribly sick with cholera on the return journey to New Hampshire, and he died before he even reached our door. Some people thought I was crazy to want to come out here and finish what he had started, to want to see the Illinois that he loved so much. But with my daughter Ruth and my daughter-in-law Caroline, I came to Elgin in 1837. My son Samuel, who was a businessman in Chicago, joined us here. Samuel had decided that he would give up his business and start to run the family farm. A couple years later, my son William, a merchant in Canada, came to Elgin as well. I had 9 children, but it's such a pleasure for a mother to see her 2 boys prospering in business and as civil servants. Both of my sons, what a lucky woman I am, both of my sons were mayors of Elgin. My son Samuel was the second mayor of Elgin. He was mayor from 1856 to 1857, and he was known as the Angel of Mercy. Samuel could be seen in the dark of night and the dead of winter, walking with his lantern held high to the house of a family who had someone who was ill. He would sit up all night with the sick person so that the family could get much needed rest. Samuel also had an addition built on his house for the sole purpose of giving the pioneers a warm bed and a hot meal on their journey west. Samuel, as I said, was a farmer, and his activism in the dairy industry helped Elgin Dairy to be the name on many of the milk wagons in Chicago. My other son, William, was also very successful as an entrepreneur and as a philanthropist. William was the mayor of Elgin in 1871, and he was a trustee of the Elgin Academy. He was also the owner of many stores on the east and west side of the river, a flour mill and a sawmill, but his most successful endeavor was the Waverly House Hotel. The Waverly House Hotel was located at what is now the Kimball Street Bridge, and it was a frequent resort for wealthy Chicagoans in the summertime. It was also a stop on the railway station going northwest. Also for us Elginites, it was a place that we liked to gather for teas and military balls and birthday parties. As much as I felt blessed to see my boys grow up, as happy as I was to watch them, it made it all the harder when they preceded me in death. My son Samuel died first in 1866. He was 57 years old. My son William died in 1875 at the age of 69. My two boys did leave me another way to remember them, though. They built their mother a house, which is actually the oldest living residence in Elgin, and you can see it today at Chicago and Crystal Streets. The house is made of cobblestone construction, which means that when farmers would plow their fields for the first time and plow up all the rocks, we would save them and use them with mortar to make the walls. The floorboards are all of oak. The house had 6 bedrooms, and I lived there until the day that I died. I died in 1888. I was 100 years, 11 months, and 24 days, or 26 days old. I was 4 days short of my 101st birthday. I had suffered a fall, which had left me partially paralyzed, and I was in a coma for the last week of my life, so I was ready to go and meet my Maker. The service for my funeral was held at the First Baptist Church, where I was a founding member. And the newspaper reported that people gazed at me with awe and reverence. I think they were probably just surprised to see a woman so old and wrinkly. The newspaper also said that people learned many lessons from my long and exemplary life. Long? Yes, definitely a long life. But exemplary, I'm not quite sure. But what I do know is that if a woman loves her family and she loves her home, then she will reap great rewards. So finally, I'd just like to say thank you to Elgin for the many wonderful years that I spent here. Happy birthday to me, and to you, a wish for many love-filled and memory-filled days of your own in this fair city. Thank you and have a pleasant afternoon.
Welcome. Imagine, if you will, you've just been asked to share your most vivid memories of your life here in Elgin. You only have a couple of moments, and those memories exceed more than half a century. I'll try. I'd love for all of you to join me. My name is Louise Schroeder. I was born in 1841, and when I was 13, my family embarked on a journey to the United States of America. We settled here in Illinois. Now, as a young girl coming of age, it wasn't very long before I had fallen in love. I fell in love with Louis Schroeder. He was handsome and 5 years my senior, and well, by the time I was 18, he had already proposed. Now, Lou had to leave me for some time as he was called for service in the Civil War Regiment. But when he came back home to me, we made our home right here in Elgin. Now, Lou was a very social man, and for some time, the early part of our marriage, he ran the meat market on the east side of town. but his proudest moment was being a founder of St. Paul's Evangelical Lutheran Church. And for me to witness those men sitting round a table, dreaming of building this structure for friends and family to gather in this booming town was really something. As I said, he was very social and always involved in St. Paul's men group, as I was involved in the ladies group as well. Now, my husband also had German descent, and he came from Hanover, Germany when he was 20 years old. He was very active in the men's German club here in town. He wore many hats. Lou was also a volunteer firefighter for Ed Joslin's Hose Company. Now, after several years in business, my husband felt as though he was heavily taxed. And so in 1897, he decided his voice should count. And so he ran for alderman of the 2nd Ward, and he won, much to the dismay of some of the dry folk in town. You see, my husband was a proprietor of a saloon over on Douglas Avenue. And during that time, around the turn of the century, liquor and ordinances over the liquor was very much a bone of contention. City Council was always arguing over the cost of the liquor licenses, the hours of operations, openings on Sundays. The debate went on and on. But even though my husband had a saloon in town, there were many others that were aldermen that had liquor licenses as well. The difference between them and my husband is that he was very vocal about it and felt that there was no conflict in interest by voting against raising the liquor licenses and also by voting to extend the hours of operation. Why, at our saloon, if we had customers that were thirsty, we served them whenever they walked in the door, regardless of the time of day. And because of this philosophy, the police were frequent visitors. I remember one disturbance where the officer walked in the door to find my husband with a black eye and a bruised nose. Oh, and then there was this one time back in 1897, another call for disturbance. The marshal kicked down the back door. Now, my husband had some friends, some young kids. They were just having a grand time, not causing any disturbance at all. Well, it was after hours. You should have read the paper the next day. They said that those kids were engaging in infidelities. But you can't always believe what the paper tells you, right? There was another incident where my husband was paraded into the police station in downtown Elgin with 9 of his patrons walking in behind him. Again, he was cited for serving liquor after hours. Well, my husband flatly denied that charge. He said that those poor folks were out in the rain and he just invited them in for lunch. Now, when you're an elected official for the city and you're constantly raided by the police, you're setting yourself up for some trouble. And even one Sunday, the pastor over at the Methodist Church denounced my husband right in the middle of his sermon. And can you believe that was only over a $25 fine? Well, despite all the controversy of my husband's saloon, he was re-elected for 7 terms. He had quite loyal voters. And when my husband was 83, he passed from this world, living a long and wonderful life here in Elgin. He left me behind with our 5 children, who by this time were all raised and living with their own families. We had one son, Albert, who lived out in West Chicago for some time and then ventured out to California. All 4 of our daughters remained here in Elgin and were married. Now, just by default, I became the eldest member of St. Paul's Lutheran Church. But I was very blessed with 6 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren, and shortly after Lou's death, I became very ill. And after 10 weeks of a severe illness, I passed away one 5 o'clock morning in Sherman Hospital. I lived a long, wonderful life here in this town, and I hope you'll enjoy the rest of your day. I want to mention that some of my best memories came from the house that we lived in for many years. That was at 275 Brook Street. It's only 5 minutes away, folks. If you have time to run by and see my house, I would really love that. Thank you for sharing your day with me.
I'm David Sharp. I am not born in Elgin. I'm a farm boy, born right out here in Hanover Township in 1856. And you know, like most farm families, we raise our own help. By that I mean I have 5 brothers and 3 sisters. When I was fully grown, and I left the farm, I moved to the city of Elgin, and there I worked with Mr. Barkley in his hardware business. I studied tinsmithing. I did become a good tinsmith. I was well known in the area and considered a very skillful person. Monday, March 23rd, 1874. I was about a little less than a year in Elgin. I was working in the hardware store. That morning, the report of an alarm came in. I asked Mr. Barkley for his permission and quickly ran out the door down to Chicago Street to see for myself. When I got there, the entire south side of the street was engulfed in flames. 2 or 3 buildings had already been destroyed. They had collapsed in on themselves. And the heat was so intense that my eyebrows were singed and I backed away. And then the wind kicked up and it blew sparks and debris across the street to the north side. It landed on the roofs and the windowsills of those wooden buildings over there. When it was all over, this entire block was destroyed. This block was 3/4 destroyed on the north side, and around the corner on the east side of Douglas Avenue, 50% of that block was gone. Well, that wasn't the worst part. Those evil March winds had blown so well that they carried sparks and debris clear up and destroyed 3 buildings on Grove and Highland Avenue, 2 blocks away. Well, I immediately joined the volunteer fire department. The disaster that I saw, that wasn't the only one. In fact, ever since the first wooden buildings were built in the city of Elgin, fire has been a constant threat. And of course, property wasn't the only thing taken by fire. One of our most prominent citizens, Mrs. Abby Wing, had a fire occur in her attic. And while she ran up the circular stairs to get a box of keepsakes to rescue, she was overcome by smoke. Before help arrived, her body was burned beyond recognition. You know, in those days, there was no city fire department. We didn't have one. The firefighting efforts were based on individuals and volunteers. The means we had for fighting fires in those days were leather buckets like this. Volunteers, people like you and me, we would stand shoulder to shoulder, take these buckets from the mill race, scooping water and passing it hand to hand to the location of the fire, and then, in that manner, trying to douse the flames. Well, not only didn't we have professional firefighters, but there were times when we had no water. That's right. We had not even water for these little buckets. Well, prompted by disaster after disaster over the years, the city administration finally did the right thing. Over the results, against the results of a public referendum that voted it down, the city administration instead built a pumping station on the east side of the Fox River and a 95-foot water tower up on the hill. Together with 13 miles of water main, some of it wooden, we finally, in 1888, had achieved a dependable and reliable supply of firefighting water. Well, I continued in the tinsmithing trade for a few years, quite a few in fact. But you know, my hands were the only part of me that was in that, because my heart was in firefighting. And so, in May of 1898, I became the full-time, yes, assistant fire marshal for the city of Elgin. And later I was promoted to chief. The purpose of a fire department is to respond to the unexpected as quickly as possible. And to that end, it's important to achieve and maintain a high level of efficiency. I think that in our department we've done that. As an example, this is a system of Gamewell fire alarm boxes that have been installed throughout the city at 16 locations since 1888. Connected by 8 miles of wire to all of the fire stations, to alarm bells located in those fire stations, just like this one. When a citizen wants to transmit an alarm and report a fire, they simply open the front door, pull the hook down, and a coded alarm signal is transmitted. It sounds like this. Anybody count that? 1-4, exactly. 1-4, the number on the box. That identifies where the alarm came from and tells us where to report to. In addition, we have arrangements with the Borden plant. When an alarm is received, the whistle on their plant sounds, instructing all the volunteers to go to Fountain Square and receive directions to the fire. We keep good records. This is our daily alarm logbook. This book details every run we make from all 5 barns. We have the date, the time the alarm was received, and how it was generated, whether it was a box or a telephone, the number of men, what stations they came from, the equipment, what stations it came from, the distance they traveled, and the location of the fire, the cause of the fire, and of course, chief on duty. One of the most important aspects of our operation is the good fire horses that we have. You know, a good fire horse is, it's like a genius, you know. It's just born, not in any way made. Out of 100, maybe one is suited to the task, and you can't tell by looking at it. Some of our companies can get an alarm, slide down the fire pole from the sleeping quarters to the main floor, hitch up the team, and be out the door in 22 seconds. We're very proud of that. This is a photograph of something else we're very proud of. It's Fire Barn number 5 down on St. Charles Street. We recently completed its construction and put it into service on January the 1st, 1904. This has brought us into the modern world of firefighting. And here you can see some of our boys in this photograph on a wagon hauled by a team, including my favorite horse, Jack. He's my favorite, and I use him for my rig whenever I have a chance. Another Monday. Monday, May 11th, 1908. I'm out with Mr. West, our chief building inspector. Our purpose for that day is to inspect the fire escapes. We're at the Fosgate Hotel on Division Street, I'm sorry. And this fire escape is a solid iron structure that extends from the top of the building on the outside down to the 2nd floor. At that point, it becomes a horizontal stairway held in place at that position by a system of counterweights and cables. Its purpose is, when stepped upon by a person descending the fire escape, to lower slowly to the sidewalk below and permit a safe journey. In testing, I walk out onto the 2nd level and I slowly put my weight on it. It doesn't quite seem to move the way it should. Down below, he says, "Please be careful," and before I pitch forward, it lunges forward and I fall down on the ground. I don't remember anymore. Let's look at the logbook here. May 8th. Here's my initials. All those before, that's me, Sharp. Anybody see well? Can you help me out here, please? Somebody? Somebody, please. I can't read this. This is an S. This is. What about the next one?
This looks like arable or something. Arable?
It's not S?
No, it's a name.
It's not S. My name's not there anymore. Well, you know, the month of May has really been significant in my life. And it was May when I was first made assistant fire marshal. And then on another May day, I was made chief. I suppose that when I fell from that fire escape, also in the month of May, and perhaps that was my final promotion. And I have for you brochures on Fire Barn Number 5 Museum. If anybody's interested, please take as many as you like. Thank you for coming.
Good afternoon. My name is Ed Reeves, and I was the 13th mayor of the city of Elgin. The current incumbent is the 35th mayor. And the first mayor you saw on this trip was Dr. Joseph Tefft. He was elected in 1854 on a prohibition ticket and ran unopposed. The reason we became a city 150 years ago is because the people of Elgin wanted power to ban saloons. And since Dr. Joseph Tefft was an opponent of the saloon, he was elected unanimously. Of course, when he left office, things changed a little. Well, fortunately for the city of Elgin, not every mayor had the view of Dr. Joseph Tefft. Some of us took a broadened view of life. I was born in upstate New York and apprenticed to a stonemason at the age of 16. In 1843, I arrived in Chicago and pursued the job of bricklayer. Then I went down to St. Louis and in the early 50s came to Elgin, Illinois. And here I erected some of the most important buildings in our early city. The first city hall on the south side of East Chicago Street I put up in 1859, and since the city couldn't afford a building, I paid for it and then charged them rent to use it. In 1856, I finished completion of the Elgin Academy building, which is now the Elgin Area Historical Society Museum on Park Street. Many of my buildings, including building for the Baptist Church, are no longer existing. I arrived in Elgin at a time when it was becoming a growing city. And then in 1861, I got the wanderlust and went off to the Sacramento, California gold fields, returned to the United States mainland by means of Central America, and then came back to Elgin. But in 1864, I went off to the west again and prospected in the Wind River Range. I built 11 flatboats on the Yellowstone River, and in the process, my horses were stolen by Mormons and Indians. I sued Brigham Young for damages and won. I came back to Elgin, and in the early 70s left for Chicago. After the Chicago fire of 1871, there was a big demand for building tradesmen of all kinds, and I prospered, putting up many of the early buildings in Chicago. Then in the middle 70s, the Depression took hold, and I came back to Elgin. It's such a terrible depression with many people unemployed that at one time everybody at the watch factory was laid off for a 3-month period. That's when I joined the Greenback Party. We had a solution to the unemployment problem. All you really had to do is print up a lot of greenbacks for money, distribute them, people would spend them and buy things, and the people would make things for the greenback money purchases, and we'd be back to prosperity again. Well, it was called the Funny Money Party by our opponents. In 1878, I decided to run for mayor of Elgin to kind of promote the idea of the Greenback Party. Unfortunately, I shouldn't have been elected mayor. In the first place, I had 3 opponents. We didn't have primaries in those days, so whoever had the most votes won. And I had only 40% of the popular vote, but it was enough to get me ahead of that sober-sided, non-drinking George P. Lord. Now, I shouldn't have been mayor for another reason. I hold grudges, and I held a grudge against Jack Powers, the city marshal. In my day, the city marshal was the chief of police, and the city jail lockup was called the city prison, just as the Elgin State Hospital today was called the Northern Illinois Insane Asylum back in 1878. Well, the first thing I did as mayor was to fire Jack Powers. Then I appointed somebody else, and the aldermen and the council refused to approve my appointments. I appointed 12 people to be the chief marshal, and every one of them was rejected by the city council. In the meantime, Jack Powers was doing his thing as the marshal of the city of Elgin. At one time, he changed the locks on the city prison, so I couldn't interfere. Then I was changing the locks back again, and he came with a group of 3 of his followers and protested. And I said, you can't put new locks on this city prison because you're destroying city property and you're under arrest. Then I shoved him in a cell and turned the key. Well, it was a big indignation meeting at the Opera House. They advised me to do one of 2 things. Either resign my office, which I have disgraced, they said, or commit myself to the Northern Illinois Insane Asylum. And many people gave thanks that mayors at that time were elected to only 1-year terms. Well, the situation was cleared up by the city council. It wasn't a compromise, it was their idea. They passed an ordinance creating the office of city janitor and keeper of the prison. And this office was responsible to the city council and to be appointed by the city council. I vetoed the ordinance, but it was overridden by a vote of 12-0. And who did the city council appoint? Jack Powers. Well, I lived with this until there was this council meeting when Alderman Jenks got up and said, I'm introducing, Mayor, a new ordinance to be enforced by the city marshal. What did you say? And Alderman Jenks backed down. Sorry, Mayor, it's to be enforced by the chief janitor and keeper of the city prison. That's better. Then in the 1880s, as I was imbibing, by the way, this is a bottle left over from the Elgin Eagle Brewing Company. It was originally called Adlerbrau, German for Eagle beer, and then it was later changed to Elgin Eagle Brewing Company. I believed as mayor in supporting local industry. Then in 1885, I received this revelation. I said, what are these people like George P. Lord, these sober-sided Methodists and others, why do they call themselves Christians? No, they are not Christians. Because Jesus of Nazareth at the Last Supper said, drink this in remembrance of me. Now, those Methodists who aren't really Christians and drink grape juice are not really following his teachings. Then in 1891, I elaborated on this. I was the first mayor to write a book, 140 pages, detailing how if you're a so-called Christian and don't drink, you're really a Muslim. Because the Muslim religion considers abstinence as an important rule. What kind of a religion is that? Oh, I have suffered a great deal of criticism in my life. One of the papers, for example, wrote my epitaph before I was even dead. Beneath this stone lies Mayor Reeves. O death, in our opinion, you should never have a greater sinner in your dark dominion. Now then, tonight you're going to go home and look at the television reports of the Cub game and the Bears game, and perhaps you'll have a cool one and do this in remembrance of me. Thank you very much. I had 3 wives, 2 children by each wife, and one of the things interesting about me, I was born and died on the same day, February 11th, 1822, February 11th, 1899. One of my 3 wives isn't buried here. Apparently she copped out. It was apparently rather difficult to be living with me. I don't know why.
Thank you.
Whatsoever you do to the least of my brethren, you do to me. Matthew 25:40. This was a Bible verse that my husband and I tried to keep close to our heart our whole life. Welcome. My name is Nellie Stiles, and I'm so glad that we could spend this time visiting on this beautiful day in this gorgeous cemetery. I was born in 1852 in Bangor, Maine, but I moved to Elgin when I was very young and always considered myself an Elginite. I married Charles Stiles, and we had 2 daughters who also married and stayed in Elgin their whole lives. Charles was a wonderful draftsman, and before the first brick was put onto the Elgin Watch Company building, he was hired. They wanted to make sure he would work for their company. While family life was extremely important to us, we also felt very strongly about our community. He worked hard to bring the Young Men's Christian Association to Elgin. He felt that if young people had better options and better activities, they could make better decisions when they were adults. I understand today you still have a YMCA building on the west side of town, which would have been far too far out of town to be any use during the time that I was here, because Elgin was much smaller. We worshiped at Grace Methodist Church in the First Congregational Church. I didn't know if any of you had an opportunity to worship there this morning, but I know people are still there, still striving to learn how to love God and serve community better. I loved nature, and I gained a great deal of peace and serenity from my involvement with the Audubon Society. But there was another issue I was involved with that seems almost the direct opposite of that activity: the Elgin City Jails. Now, no one considers a jail a good place to be, but truly, from 1860 to the early 1900s, Elgin jails were horrid. First of all, they were housed in some place that nobody else had any use for, underground, in the basement of City Hall. Because they were underground, they were very near the sewers, so the noxious fumes would permeate the air. Of course, we're right by the Fox River, and being underground, the jail was always damp, and sometimes even flooded. At that time, different populations were put together in the same area. Men and women were very close. They were separated by a flimsy partition, but anything that was said or done on one side of the partition could be heard on the other side. Also, different peoples with different offenses were housed together. You could have thieves and ruffians right next to insane people or homeless people. As a matter of fact, young children, not much older than that young lady right there, if they were orphans or perhaps had committed a crime, had taken something from a neighborhood store, could be put there right next to hardened criminals. Well, I was a member of the Elgin Women's Club, their reform committee, and we decided to take on this issue. We had many different ways of doing so. First of all, we read the Elgin ordinances, and the Elgin ordinance forbade people from sleeping below ground. Their own jail was in violation of their ordinance. We did some work on alternative sites for the jail, perhaps the 4th floor of the City Hall, or even a separate building. And we developed financial information to show that while it would be somewhat more expensive, it wasn't exceedingly so. We met with the mayor. I know mayors can sometimes be difficult, but we sat with Arnold Price and we convinced him of our point of view. He ended up writing a letter to the newspaper talking about the situation in the jail, and he also urged the city council to vote more money to this cause. Another interesting thing happened. A very bright young man who worked with the Elgin Salvation Army had been jailed during a protest. We urged him to go to the paper, and we suggested that he tell his story, which he did to great effect. Our reform committee was finally allowed to tour the jail, and then again we could talk about the situation, having experienced it just a little bit ourselves. Well, as people in Elgin became more aware of the situation, these good people did agree that the situation should be changed. And eventually, gradually, it was. Now, while the Elgin City Jail is certainly no luxurious place, it is safe and it is sanitary, and you are given nutritious meals during your time there. The people that came out of the jails during my time were so weak in body, mind, and spirit. They also found themselves making return visits. Now I understand that you can gain training and sometimes high school credit so that you would have more options once you left. My neighbor said to me, "Nellie, why are you choosing to work on this activity with these types of people?" And I had to think back to the Bible verse that I opened our conversation with today. And even in the year 2004, it's probably a good idea to ponder. Whatever you do to the least of my brethren. Thank you. My actual grave is over the hill next to the military graves. In fact, it's right across the street from where we hold the Memorial Day celebration. Since this is the 150th celebration of our city's incorporation, all the people have something to do with the early city or government of Elgin. So while my story fit in with the theme, my grave didn't. So that's why we're over here. But this is a perfect place, and so next year I want to be Marie Louise or. Thank you. Thank you.